The late 1970s and early 1980s were hosts to all sorts of new and somewhat inventive comedies that are still hailed as classics to this day. And only one of these movies would be the 1980 golf comedy Caddyshack, a farce about a bunch of colorful characters getting into all sorts of wacky antics at a country club. This movie has been hailed by some as one of the funniest movies ever made, and panned by others as one of the most overrated comedies of all time. But regardless of one's personal feelings towards it, there's no denying that Caddyshack is indeed considered a comedy classic in most circles today. But, for various reasons, it very nearly didn't end up that way. And today, I'd like to go over all the different ways this movie managed to become a cult classic despite seemingly having everything stacked against it. And there will be spoilers for this movie ahead, so in case you've been meaning to see it and don't want anything ruined, you probably shouldn't proceed with this video. Alright, so to start at the beginning, Caddyshack was originally envisioned as a simple tale of a teenager working as a caddy at a high-class country club, having to deal with life on the course while trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life. However, first-time director Harold Ramis's love of improvising quickly caused things to fall off the rails, as whole scenes not in the script were added in and filmed on the spot. And what only exacerbated this problem was the presence of three comedians who were only supposed to have cameo roles, that being Chevy Chase, Rodney Dangerfield, and Bill Murray, with all three impressing Ramis so much that he started giving them more and more scenes and let their improv run wild. And as a result, by the end of filming, they were left with 4.5 hours of footage that was completely incoherent, unwatchable, and had no ending to speak of. But instead of trying to release that monstrosity in theaters like you would have almost expected them to, they managed to get their hands on an editor that was famous for editing comedy movies, and was especially well known for his collaborations with noted comedy writer and director Blake Edwards, who managed to not only cut down the movie to a watchable length, but even managed to give it something of a plot line to boot. So with this new version to work off of, Ramis and the other writers then wrote an ending to suit what they now had, and also added in the gopher subplot just to help tie everything together a little better. So after having filmed the scenes with the gopher and the new ending, they were left with the movie Caddyshack as we all know it today. But even then, the movie as it was still presented a few problems. The plot was still pretty all over the place, the main character is regularly sidelined in favor of other characters, and there aren't too many conventionally likable characters to boot. But in spite of all of that, people loved it. Now, why all these setbacks, both in the actual filming and the movie that was released, didn't ultimately sink the movie isn't entirely clear, but a few theories can easily be put forth. Because for one thing, comedy lovers of that era were used to the somewhat arbitrary plot. A lot of comedies of the late 70s and early 80s, and especially the kind that Caddyshack was associated with, didn't usually have the tightest plots. Sure, they often had some kind of theme or story that ran throughout the entire thing, but it wasn't uncommon for these movies to veer off track for a bit just for the sake of being funny. So when Caddyshack often did this for admittedly very different reasons, the audience didn't care and probably even came to expect it because it had already been done quite a few times before in movies they had loved. And not to mention, most of these detours in the quote-unquote plot can be pretty funny, which makes their huge presence even more forgivable, especially for the era in which it was released. And the same thing pretty much applies to why it isn't such a big deal that the main character ends up somewhat sidelined when all's said and done. Because he's being sidelined in favor of very colorful characters who help make the movie as memorable as it is. And not to mention, it's not like his story is ever lost entirely. He remains a constant presence throughout, with his need to go to college never being forgotten about, and in the end he still gets his happy ending and a resolution to his problems. Because somewhat impressively, the writers make sure to have him still be a big part of the new ending, even with all the other characters taking over the story, with it pretty much coming down to him to win the big game. Admittedly with some help, but the point is that he still remains a crucial part of the whole thing. So while the story may not be exactly his, it's not to the point that shifting between him and the other characters is really ever to the movie's detriment. And then, of course, there's perhaps the movie's most impressive feat of having a ton of lovable characters, despite the fact that none of them are all that conventionally likable. Think about it. Pretty much everybody in the movie is portrayed as some kind of idiot, jerk, or self-righteous snob. And yet, you can't help but like most of them regardless. And that mainly comes down to the fact that most of the characters' flaws are never taken too far or played too seriously. For example, Danny is no saint, but in the end he does ultimately want to be a good person and do the right thing, which the ending gives him the perfect chance to do. Ty Webb may be a bit clueless and out there, but in the end he is a pretty nice guy who is shown to have firm moral standards. And Carl Spackler may be a complete moron who takes his orders to get rid of the gopher way too far, but that's exactly what makes him so funny. He's the coyote to the gopher's roadrunner, and his incompetence only makes his antics even funnier. And besides, just like the others, when he isn't hunting gophers in the most ineffective ways possible, it's not like he's a bad person or anything like that. And, of course, there's Al Shervix. And let me just say, most of the credit for him has to go to Rodney Dangerfield. Because despite the fact that he's rude, obnoxious, shameless, and throws his money around like party favors, he might just be the funniest character in the movie, and by far the most memorable. Because he's also very lively, fun, and much better than Judge Smales by comparison. And speaking of him, Smales is pretty much the one character the movie doesn't want the audience to like, and does a pretty good job at that. Because while Smales may have an understandable dislike of Shervix, he takes that grudge way too far, and combining that with all the other questionable things he does easily makes him a character you want to see lose. Especially when he brags about sending teenage boys to the electric chair. But the point is, for such a messy production and writing process, as well as a cast full of, at first glance, unlikable characters, the movie does an absolutely perfect job of having the characters come across exactly as intended. Though, of course, the immense talents of comedians like Chase, Murray, Ted Knight, and especially Dangerfield probably also helped this particular point along as well. Now listen, if you personally don't like the movie or believe it's overrated, that's absolutely fine. I'm simply trying to explain why the movie was so popular in its day despite everything that was stacked against it. And that mainly comes down to finding the right man to edit down all the footage they had, and then building off of what they had in all the right ways to make it an entertaining little comedy full of fun characters. And in 1980, audiences loved it. Today, however, I highly doubt a movie with the same production would ultimately end up getting the same results, especially with plot being a much bigger priority than back then, even in comedies. But whether you love or hate the movie, I'm pretty sure we can all agree on the fact that if there was ever a comedy classic that, quote, wasn't supposed to be, it would be this movie. Through a combination of editing, some well-placed laughs, and talented comedians at the top of their game, this movie managed to defy all odds and tickle the funny bones of many an audience member back in the early 80s. Alright, I think that's everything I got on that. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you honestly think it was a miracle that Caddyshack became as popular as it did, considering everything it had stacked against it? Or are you not surprised that it turned out the way it did? Please let me know in the comments. And remember, you don't have to like the movie just because you watched this video. I was simply trying to explain the unlikeliness of it becoming so popular, and not actually how good of a movie it is on its own. So if you absolutely despise it, that's completely fine. And thank you all for watching. It is very greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.